Hello again. Welcome to another edition of Media Watch. I'm your co-host, Eric Tait.
I'm Bob Anthony. Good to see you again, Eric.
And once more into Whether It's the Breach or Not, Bob, here we go again. Brought to you with the good graces of Manhattan Neighborhood Network and EVT Educational Productions. So, normal procedure, we pre-tape, and this is like the middle of the week preceding Monday, and this is going to air on a Monday. And that will be about a week after we got word about the passing of Julian Bond, Bob.
That's about right, yeah. A long-term civil rights activist. I believe I met him in the 80s when he came to Milwaukee for a couple of appearances. I don't remember the story that I wrote, but I just remember the number of people who really wanted to see him at the time.
The interesting about Julian Bond is he was so young when he burst on the scene as one of the co-founders of the SNCC, I guess it was. That was the acronym, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And he basically, from the age of 17 till his passing, was in the forefront, definitely in the forefront of the struggle for, basically people call it civil rights, but for Julian Bond it was basically a struggle for human dignity and human rights.
Right. And his eloquence, and you and I have heard him speak numerous times, was off-putting to those who opposed him. They hated the fact that he could eloquently debate so well and knock down their arguments, and it was so casually and beautifully done. I don't want to say he made enemies, but he was a formidable opponent in a debate.
Julian Bond never lost his cool. I mean, he may have lost his cool privately, but I've never, to my knowledge, ever seen him in any public forum under whatever duress ever lose his cool. He always rebutted folks with fact, calmly, succinctly, and devastatingly.
Yes.
So they're one of the organizations that he was on the board of put out a headline, "We have lost a giant." And pretty much that speaks to the tributes that have been paid to Julian Bond since his passing. And here at Media Watch, we're no exception. When the media does it right, we give them praise. And they've been doing it right when it comes to telling Julian Bond's history, importance, and significance.
I mean, he had a long political career, but to what he actually, the important things that he actually did and are remembered for, the political career is almost an afterthought. He did so much outside of that circle on his own, or representing SNCC or any of the other civil rights organizations. But you're right, he was smooth, very calm, and he would devastate you with the facts. And that's what made him so useful during that period. He could kill you with seemingly kindness, but he had the facts at hand, and you couldn't really defend yourself.
One of the key things that I've always been grateful for Julian Bond for having been seminal in establishing was the Southern Poverty Law Center. Julian Bond was the very founding president of the Southern Poverty Law Center, and he and Morris Dees over the years made sure that that organization documented and tracked and kept tabs of all those right-wing hate groups that had been spewing hate, proliferating, and continuing to proliferate in this country. And if he had done nothing but help found that, he would have done this country a major service. So yeah, it's fitting that we're recalling the phenomenal work, the long-term battlefront in the efforts for human dignity, human rights, and the what I call the bottom rung of the struggle, civil rights, which is what they always want to put it under. Because basically the tenor of the country as he passed has gotten to the stage where in an analysis of what's going on, which basically we might as well tie it to all these various stories that are percolating and germinating from politics to Ferguson anniversaries to whatever, Bond's life and legacy seamlessly is in the forefront of what's going on today. Well, where do we want to start, basically? Because if we think about it, on the 29th of August, which is about 4 days, 4 or 5 days after this program airs, August 29th will be the 60th anniversary of the murder of Emmett Till.
Right.
So, I mean, just remind our viewers, or even our younger viewers who don't even remember who Emmett Till was.
Well, I mean, I don't remember how old he was when he was
14.
When he was
14.
lynched by a mob,
Shot through the head.
Right.
In a, I mean, just horrendous. But it was a while before they found his body.
and it was an allegation that he had said something to a
Whistled
woman,
or eyeballed a white
woman,
right?
And this is a 14-year-old kid,
someplace in Money, Mississippi, right? And at the age of 14, he was murdered, and that basically was the modern restart of what became known as the civil rights movement. But basically, if you take it back to the abolitionist movement in the previous century, the struggle for human rights for black people in this country. And so...
And that was one, I'm sorry to interrupt, that was one instance where the media photo of the aftermath of what the mob did to him was a lightning rod. That's a point where the media published a photo which...
His mother said,
yes,
this is going to be an open casket.
Right.
That was it.
And the open casket showed...
And she allowed the photographers to take pictures of what her son looked like in that coffin. And it was just the most devastating sight that could have been sent around the world. And it was.
Go ahead and Google the photo of Emmett Till and take a look, because that photo is a famous one. It's still on the internet, and that's still one of the worst photos I've ever witnessed of a human being, dead or alive. I mean, when you see what the result of the damage to his body was, you wonder what type of human being could have done that to another one and called that justice. Yeah, the media, and like you said, it was his mother who made sure that casket would be open. Yeah. And that casket itself is on its way to being rehabbed after years of neglect. That's a whole nother story.
They're gonna put it on display in the new African American Museum that's being built as we speak in Washington D.C. Out there on the mall, wherever that structure is going up in Washington D.C. That's one of many significant quote artifacts of African Americans' existence, life, struggle, battle for freedom, dignity, first-class citizenship in this country. Emmett Till's casket.
And it's something we almost lost because it was badly neglected, I believe, in a suburban Chicago cemetery, and basically they forgot it was there. And when it was found, it was in an awful state of decay. And someone found it and raised enough money, and now we will at least have that little nugget of, heart-rending history to on display in the new...
Right, and as the curator has said, I believe on PBS or wherever, it's not just going to be tragedies, there will be triumphs on display in that museum. And so Julian Bond came to the forefront not long after Emmett Till's murder, because what happens, 10 years later, by that galvanized civil rights movement because of Till's death, when Lyndon Johnson succeeded John F. Kennedy after the Kennedy assassination, he made it his business to push through the Civil Rights Act that Kennedy had fought so hard for as a way of paying homage to the deceased president. And then the very next year, he did his best to also cajole, arm twist, and whatever in 1965 to get the Voting Rights Act passed. Right. And so what you have really in 2015 are a number of interesting anniversaries that tie to Julian Bond's life and struggle. Bond passes in 2015 at age 75. Voting Rights Act passed in 65. Voting Rights Act recently gutted by the current United States Supreme Court.
Unfortunately, right.
Right, and of course there are now all kinds of movement to try to get it restored and to send the petitions out and to cajole and harangue. And they said it was no longer needed. And what are we finding about recent reports on voting rights curtailment and?
Right. I mean, you can pick a state. You can pick North Carolina, where it's been sliced and diced, and new laws have been added. And we were talking before we went on air about Texas. And
the Texas voter ID law, right? Which basically online report. Another one of these think tanks that do all these research, which I should have called up, but the thrust of it was not only is the Texas voter ID law having the effect that it was designed to have in curtailing minority voters, but it's also causing other voters to not show up at the polls for the simple reason that a lot of these individuals, for some reason, get the wrong idea, wrong impression, wrong information that the ID that they have, which actually is valid, will not work for them, and they therefore just don't bother going to the polls. So in effect, the law is doing double deleterious effect on the voting population in the state of Texas. And there's been other studies that basically target the fact that all those laws across the country have disproportionately negative effect on the elderly, minority, young, and disabled people when it comes to getting that type ID. So those people get automatically disenfranchised just because of these. And they're all passed with one basic thrust. We need to do this to combat voter fraud.
Right.
And when there's an investigation done in every one of those states about the prevalence of voter fraud, the reports come back with little to none. And so the laws are not really necessary, but they're rammed through specifically to depress the voter turnout in those specific communities.
Would it be okay if I read a couple lines from the New York Times editorial on this subject?
Please.
I mean, because it drives in the point. And in today there are no poll taxes or literacy tests. Instead, there are strict and unnecessary voter identification requirements or cutbacks to early voting and same-day registration, all of which are known to disproportionately burden black voters. And the relative subtlety of the newer measures did not make them any less insidious, but it does make them more resistant to charges of illegality. In other words, it's easier for them to get away with these rules that make it more difficult to register. I believe it was North Carolina used to have a same-day registration provision, which was tossed out, a pre-registration provision for younger pre-voters that was removed, and a lot of the conveniences that the state voters once had were under the color of this new Supreme Court decision, just removed as if they weren't needed. So yes, there's a bit of a pushback.
So the fact that a lion of the movement like Julian Bond passes within the 50th anniversary of the passage of the Voting Rights Act, on his demise, I'm sure he's shaking his head about one battle that has to be refought again.
Right.
And so, it's a long, what did I call it? And then I'll be free to travel home. The never-ending struggle. Okay. So that never-ending struggle for freedom and full first-class citizenship continues. And of course, these anniversaries just keep rolling in on us, because that same year of 1965 was one of the major urban uprisings in the country, and it took place on the West Coast in the city of LA. And the neighborhood that at the time was not known as what it became known as erupted, and it became known as the Watts riots.
Right.
And Earl Caldwell, our old compatriot, colleague, had a column that talks about that. We want to share a little bit of Earl's column with you because it speaks to how things were covered. There are some other reports also that were not happy about the LA Times getting a Pulitzer Prize for their coverage of the Watts riots, the Watts Uprisings, I call it. but Earl has a different take on how things changed slightly because of people of color being where they were during that riot. And
Earl, I guess he's teaching now in Hampton.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah.
And
writing something called the Caldwell Chronicles or the Caldwell Journals.
The Caldwell Journals, yes. And he wrote this just a few days ago, obviously, with the anniversary of Watts coming up. And he notes that the Los Angeles Times, which won a Pulitzer for the coverage of the Watts Uprisings,
yes.
Okay, did not have a black reporter on its staff. So it had to reach down into the organization of the paper, and find someone who was black who could go inside and give them
a young gentleman by the name of.
Let's see. It was Mr. Richardson. Here we go. At the very top of Robert Richardson's stories, above the headlines and in bold letters, were the editors put two words: eyewitness account. They were making sure that readers of the Los Angeles Times understood, and. But in much smaller type further down, it says that Robert Richardson, 24, a Negro, is an advertising salesman for the Times. And that was the newspaper's way of admitting that it did not have a single reporter who was black. And he wrote, let's say, he reported story after story from the front lines, and the stories appeared under his byline on the front page. He phoned his reports in to a rewrite person, which is something I did when I was a reporter.
Explain to our viewers how that works, Bob, because some folks don't really,
Sure. I mean, for example, I would cover an event or a city hall meeting or something like that. And remember, this is in the age before cell phones and the internet.
You're looking for a payphone, folks.
Right. So to get the news back to the newspaper before deadline, first you had to find a payphone, and then you called it into the newsroom where there was a rewrite person, which is something that I did, which would basically put the phone on the shoulder, take the notes from the person calling in, and create a paragraph out of that. So the person wouldn't necessarily be dictating a story. He would be dictating.
He's feeding you data,
right,
factual information from the event that's going on.
Right.
And you are doing your best to collect all that data, shape it into a paragraph
readable
that makes sense.
And that is what he apparently did. He called in from the
front lines of the Watts Uprisings.
over and over, and that's the way the LA Times got its
pretty much got their Pulitzer Prize based
on someone who was not a reporter. And we were talking about this before. Even his advertising representative title was a little bit inflated.
Yeah, that's what he said later on. I think Earl quotes him in the article. Now, of course, there was another analysis done on that. Richard Prince had it in his journalisms, and I clicked on one of the links, and the interesting thing was the analysis was the thrust of the LA Times' reporting was basically shock, surprise that these folks were in a rioting mode and were actually rioting, and why would they be doing something like that? Pretty much that was the tenor of the reporting for the entire series.
Exactly.
So in hindsight, you got to look at a one-sided perspective of a serious news story that today were being covered. For instance, because things like that are still going on today, when you look at the analysis of what's been going on in Ferguson, which is the anniversary of Michael Brown's slaying and Darren Wilson's acquittal, whatever. you get a much more nuanced coverage of what's going on
Absolutely.
in Ferguson than you would have gotten 50 years ago in the Los Angeles Times, because you would see on the Ferguson reports today, after 24 hours of peaceful protests, violence erupts, as opposed to violence erupts in Ferguson anniversary protests, which would be the way it would have been run probably not just 50 years ago, probably 2 years ago. But because people are holding a magnifying glass to how news reporting is done and how many different sources are being put into those news reports, you're getting a much more in-depth coverage. And yeah, we commend that when it happens, and we try to blast it out of the water when it doesn't. Continuing in the anniversary vein, because it's interesting that I went to see a couple of days ago the release of Straight Outta Compton. And the reason I wanted to see Straight Outta Compton right away wasn't because I wanted to inflate the box office or anything, but because I knew we were going to be taping this show. And I wanted to get a sense of what the tenor of the times was for those young men in Compton back in the early 80s and through that arc that their career is covered in Straight Outta Compton.
So you wanted to sort of judge the honesty of the document?
Not so much the honesty, but just a historical perspective.
Okay.
Because we know that Ferguson and what's the town in Texas where the young lady is found dead in a cell?
You're talking about the Sandra Bland case, but
Sandra
I don't remember
Bland,
the city.
Yeah, and we're talking about the other suburbs in Dallas, Texas, where the cop has got his knee into this young lady at some pool party.
Right.
What we're looking at in 2015 is the same treatment of young blacks, male or female, that these NWA, Ice Cube, Dr. Dre, Eazy-E, all these kids, they were basically kids at the time, were rebelling against, and they were rebelling against it with their music. They as one line in the movie is, "Hey, we ain't got any AKAs. I mean, we don't have any gun import licenses. We got no passports. But all this drug is flooding into our community, and we ain't got any planes. We don't have any boats." They say, you need to check the source. Great line. Yes. I understand what he's saying. Right. But what they put out was basically they had a occupying police force in their neighborhood that gave them no room to breathe, gave them no room to be themselves. And so out of that kind of treatment came F the police and all that other hard gangster rap. Because as one of them said, our art is reflecting the reality we face. This is not sugarcoating anything. And basically they were correct. And so in looking at that movie and seeing the bookend of 1980s to 2015, they basically could write F the police today. Okay. And it would still be on target. I mean, it's just horrendous that pretty much, despite everything that's gone in this arc, nothing seems to have changed.
Because back then they didn't have the internet, you didn't have Twitter, you didn't have cell phones, you couldn't really record what was going on, your interaction with police or how the police were dealing with the neighborhood. But through the music, they could get the word out, and through their lyrics.
But by the 90s, people were videotaping. That's where Rodney King came. In the 90s, you had this video of the cops just lambasting this guy.
But it wasn't ubiquitous. You couldn't get it into every little...
Well, that's true. But
everyone didn't have one in their pocket.
That's right. But when they spread that video far and wide, everybody went, well, is this what these guys do all the time? And of course, NWA was telling them that 10 years earlier. Right. And so here's the proof and video, and they're going, oh, okay, we finally caught him on camera. And lo and behold, what happens? They take the trial to Simi Valley, and every one of them gets off. And what do we have now? We don't have Watts. We have the next reincarnation of Watts.
Absolutely. And I still remember what the jury said. One of the things that the jury said in that trial is that Rodney King was in control of the incident. He had control. He could have defused it himself.
Oh, really?
And I was wondering where that...
What video were they looking at?
What logic that came from. but okay,
so that was, and I know Ice Cube, who was one of the executive producers of Straight Outta Compton, was quoted as saying they wanted to get that movie released right on top of the anniversary of the Watts riots.
Okay.
And so they were pushing and pulling and trying to get everything down to the wire at the last minute. They managed to make their release. Let's see, we're on Monday. I think it's the 2 Fridays before or something to that
That's
effect.
about right.
I think it came
Based
out on the
on the
17th
time.
or something like that. Yeah. So, yeah, and my understanding is big box office, something like 55, 65 million opening weekend.
Not only big box office, but very, very good reviews. It's not like it's they didn't they didn't do half a story. They apparently got the true essence of it. I mean, you saw it, I did, but the reviews coming back were very solid.
It gripped me. It was engrossing. I mean, there are flaws to it, but for a story that's basically a rags to riches Horatio Alger story.
Sure.
I'm serious. That's exactly what Straight Outta Compton is. I kid you not, folks. But it's based in young blacks rebelling against a totally dominant system that was trying to negate their existence and their humanity, much less their manhood. And so to overcome that in such a powerful way is an amazing story. Yeah, I recommend Straight Outta Compton. Not a real movie review, but just from where we are. We only got about a minute and a half left.
Exactly.
And we haven't hit all your anniversaries, because guess what? The 10th anniversary of the Katrina devastation.
Right.
That's this particular summer. I think it's this same week that we're airing. It might even be August 25th as an anniversary. We'd have to double check it. Close to that. And there are elements of police brutality and police shooting unarmed black folk in the wake of Katrina at one of the particular bridges. Which was that?
It was the Danziger Bridge, where I think 2 people were killed and 4 were wounded and they had done nothing, essentially.
Right. And basically, those guys were actually brought up on trial for a change.
They were brought up on trial. They were convicted, and the conviction was vacated by the federal court, and now they're waiting a new trial. But for the moment, they're free, and the people they shot are still dead.
So the more things change, the more they stay the same, because if you're law enforcement and you decide to shoot black people, based on the history that we've seen thus far, seems like you get away with doing that. So I don't know. There's some more stuff that we could talk about, but we're out of time. So this has been Media Watch. I'm Eric Tait.
I'm Bob Anthony. Good talking to you, Eric.
Always a pleasure, Bob. And folks, we will catch you the next time, and thank Manhattan Neighborhood Network and EVT Educational Productions. So long.